konnichiwa! Today, I want to start by introducing a new concept that we're going to spend some time on in Chapter 18. This is a concept that we have kind of come up against before, but we've never really talked about in detail. So we're going to take a look at it today. Before I start talking about this specific to Japanese, though, I want to introduce a grammar term that some of you probably have heard before, but might not be that familiar with. The concept of transitive versus intransitive verbs. So a transitive verb is something where somebody does an action to an object. Somebody does something that affects a direct object in some way. Whereas an intransitive verb is when an object or a person does something by themselves. Not to anything else, just acting on their own. So we don't talk about this too much in English because English only has a couple of verbs that are different in transitive versus intransitive. I think if your English teacher has ever gotten snippy with you about telling the difference between lie and lay, lie down versus lay down, I can't actually remember which is which, or telling the difference between, I guess one that stands out is a tree falls versus to fell a tree. But those aren't words that really come to us all the time, right? So this is a concept that we don't have as much in English as we do in Japanese. In Japanese, this is a fairly important concept. So we have transitive verbs where somebody does an action to an object. These are verbs where we use the particle o. And we have intransitive verbs where an object or a person acts on their own about something. And these are verbs where we tend to have the particle ga. So o, transitive verb, or ga, intransitive verb. So we're going to look at a couple of examples using some of the new vocabulary from this chapter. Let's take a look. So way back in chapter 6, we learned akeru, as in doa o akeru. So this is one that we've been using for a long time, to open a door. But today we'll also learn doa ga akimasu. Aku. Aku is for when the door opens by itself. So aku means a door opens, whereas akeru means somebody opens a door. So doa o akemasu versus doa ga akimasu. In the same way, we have shimemasu, shimeru, which we learned back in chapter 6. So doa o shimemasu, to close a door. But if the door closes by itself, we have to use shimaru. Doa ga shimarimasu, the door closes. So shimemasu, shimarimasu. Doa o shimemasu, doa ga shimarimasu. Next, we have tsukeru. Once again, this is one of the ones that we learned way back in chapter 6. So denki o tsukemasu is to turn on the light. Denki ga tsukimasu, a new one from this chapter, means the light turns on. So denki o tsukemasu versus denki ga tsukimasu. In the same way, from chapter 6, we have kesu, keshimasu. So denki o keshimasu, we turn out the lights. Versus kieru, kiemasu. So rousoku ga kiemasu. The candle goes out on its own. So denki o keshimasu, rousoku ga kiemasu. We have new from this chapter, oyu o wakasu, to boil water, versus oyu ga waku, the water boils. So oyu o wakasu, that's us turning on the heat, and yu ga waku is what happens when the water starts boiling. So oyu o wakashimasu versus お湯が沸きます. The next pair we have is 落とす versus 落ちる. So グラスを落とします to drop a glass versus グラスが落ちます. A glass falls off of something. So 落とします 落ちます. You drop something versus something or someone falls. Next we have 壊す versus 壊れる. So お茶を壊します. I'm sorry, おもちゃを壊します. You break a toy. Versus おもちゃが壊れます. The toy breaks on its own. So おもちゃを壊します. おもちゃが壊れます. Our next set of new ones is 汚す versus 汚れる. So 汚す means like to get something dirty. 汚れる means something gets dirty. So 服を汚します. You get your clothes dirty. 服が汚れます. Your clothes get dirty on their own. So once again, these sets of pairs, transitive verbs are ones where somebody does an act to an object, whereas intransitive verbs are ones where the object or the person acts on their own. Transitive verbs we always mark with the particle o, and intransitive verbs we always mark with ga. So, けいこさんが電気をつけました. Keiko-san turned on the lights. So this sentence focuses on Keiko-san flipping the switch and making the light turn on. Whereas, 電気がつきました. The light turns on. So this focuses on the light coming on. This might be used in a situation like a street light, where the light just comes on automatically, right? Nobody presses a button to turn it on. Or we might say, 貴子さんがお湯を沸かしました. お湯が沸きました. So, 貴子さん put the water to boil. So she put it in a kettle, she turned on the switch on the oven or on the stove, and she's waiting for it to boil. Versus お湯が沸きました. This is when the water starts boiling of its own accord. So this is the difference between transitive and intransitive verbs. There are also some other transitive and intransitive verb pairs, which we have mentioned before in Genki, but haven't really gotten into in a lot of depth. For example, we learned クラスを始めます versus クラスが始まります. So クラスを始めます is what your teacher does. They begin the class. Whereas クラスが始まります is what the class does. The class starts. In the same way, we have like 鍵を見つけます. You find your keys. Versus 鍵が見つかります. Your keys are found. 子供を起こします. You wake up a child. Versus 子供が起きます. The child wakes up on their own. 本をカバンに入れます. You put a book in your bag. Versus 犬が家に入ります. The dog goes into the house. 宿題を出します. You take out and turn in your homework. Versus 田中さんが家から出ます. Tanaka-san goes out of the house. So these are some verb pairs that we have briefly touched on but haven't really gone into the transitive-intransitive difference. So 始めます versus 始まります. 見つけます versus 見つかります. 起こします versus 起きます. 入れます versus 入ります. And 出します versus 出ます. So, is there a pattern to showing whether a verb is transitive or intransitive? Not really. A lot of the time there'll be, like, if it has an ending with su, it's more likely to be transitive than intransitive. So like okosu, otosu, kowasu, yogosu, kesu, wakasu are all sus, right? Whereas if it has a ku ending, it's more likely to be intransitive, like tsuku, waku, aku. This is sometimes true, but it's not like a perfect rule, and there's plenty of verbs that don't end with either of those endings. So some of them you just have to memorize. To me, by far the most helpful way to keep track of whether something is transitive or intransitive is to memorize it together with the particle. So even I sometimes, when I have trouble remembering which verb to use, will stop and think, okay, this one is, so it's o akeru versus ga aku. Okay, so I want ga aku here. So thinking about the particle can be really helpful because we already know that o is the one that you act on. Like o shows what you act on. And we already know that ga shows something doing something. So the particle can be very helpful. Okay. So now that I've introduced some of the concept of transitive versus intransitive verbs, see if you can complete the exercises below.